very hard to foster conversations about racism and anti-Blackness in our community, and they're very excited to bring you this webinar today. A disclaimer before we get started, the views presented in this webinar are our own and not affiliated with any particular organization. Our panelists, along with myself, are South Asian, and for this reason, we've made sure that our questions are very specifically about the South Asian and our own experiences. Now, before the panelists introduce themselves, I would like to do a very quick land acknowledgement. Although we are having this conversation virtually, we are all still calling in from stolen Indigenous land. I am currently on Ohlone and Ramaytush land near San Francisco, and the majority of the greater Seattle area is on Coast Salish and Duwamish land. Territory acknowledgement is just a way that people can insert an awareness of Indigenous presence and land rights in everyday life. However, these acknowledgements can very easily be a token gesture rather than a meaningful practice. All settlers, including recent arrivals, all of us have a responsibility to consider what it means to acknowledge the history and legacy of colonialism. So we just ask that you take some time out of your day or week to learn about the Indigenous history of the land you're living on. Now onto introductions. My name is Tanaya Sardesai. My pronouns are she, hers, and I will be moderating this conversation. I just finished my third year at Pomona College, where I'm studying politics and South Asian studies. I'm actually taking a gap year this year and spending some time working with an organization called Win Without War Education Fund, which essentially works to demilitarize the U.S., both abroad and within our own police forces. I like to take an anti-capitalist, anti-racist approach to my work, centering both accessibility and disability rights. Now, before we get started, I'd just like to welcome anyone to message me or the panelists about any accessibility needs you may have during this webinar, and we will do our best to meet them. So to kick off introductions, we'll start with Shireen.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for being here. My name is Shireen Nori. I use she, they pronouns, and I'm based in Seattle, Washington in the Duwamish Territory. I got my start as an organizer for racial justice and reproductive justice actually back in 2010 when I was about 15. I continued organizing, particularly after the murder of Trayvon Martin in 2012. He was a Black 17-year-old teenager who was murdered in his own neighborhood. So over the past decade plus, I've worked with organizations like Planned Parenthood and have worked with a number of elections, including the 2018 midterm elections and the 2016 presidential elections. Most recently, I worked in the climate justice movement at an organization called 350.org and co-coordinated the 2019 climate strikes. And in October, I'll be joining an organization called Kairos as a program manager to support orgs like Black Lives Matter with digital organizing and political strategy. And I will pass it to Yash.
Hi, my name is Yash. My pronouns are he, him, and I started doing advocacy work on like the topic of racism because I felt like the education on this topic is like rooted a lot deeper than like what the media usually tells us. So like as youth, like we have the power and potential to like learn and like spread this knowledge and to make our own identity.
Hi, my name is Oviya Krishnan, she, her pronouns, and I've worked in climate justice advocacy groups in the past, such as Seattle Youth Climate Action Network, or SciCan, and I've had conversations with peer and families, but I wanted to get more involved in advocacy, so I found this to be like a really good opportunity to both educate myself and others about our place, especially in standing with the Black community through history and like moving forward, especially in like initiating conversations.
Hello, I'm Vennela and I go by she, her. I got into advocacy because I believe that it is incredibly important for accurate and reliable information to be available to all people, especially in this time. And advocacy is a wonderful way to spread it.
Hi, I'm Anya Vashisht. I go by she, her pronouns. I built an interest in activism around the 2016 presidential election. And I've had many meaningful discussions about racism and discrimination and felt many emotions around the death of George Floyd. So I wanted to take direct action in support of Black lives.
Hi, I'm Pranay. I go by he, him pronouns. And the reason I wanted to join advocacy is because I wanted to educate myself and hopefully others about how racism affects me as an individual, my community, and other communities as well.
Hi, my name is Divij Ashwinkumar. I use he, him pronouns. I joined advocacy because before I didn't have a trustworthy source of information or places that I could go to get to like rely on unbiased source like information about events and issues within our world. So I joined advocacy to learn more on my own because I thought self-research would help me out a lot, and it would also help me educate others that may be stuck in a similar situation that I was in.
Perfect. Thank you, everyone. So we can just jump right in with the first question. So from our conversations and from your conversations this summer, why would you say that we are responsible for educating ourselves and others about the violence inflicted upon the Black community? And anyone feel free to step in at any time.
So I feel it's really important for us to be responsible and also know that we're responsible for educating ourselves and others about violence within Black communities, because a lot of us are influenced by the role of media in perpetuating false information about events around the world. And also many of us use social media as our only outlet of information about some topics, which may lead to some bias within the news that we hear. And really, we should be centering what we hear based on the voices of people who have had firsthand experiences. In other words, Black voices. And I feel it's really important that we do this because they're the primary sources. They're the people who have experienced these things. And it's important that they have a chance to get their voice heard so that everyone else knows what they struggle through every day.
I can share a personal story about when I was in second grade. There was this girl, and it was about like 2 months into the school year, and she came up to me and she was like, "Oh yeah, this entire time I thought you were Black and that's why I was treating you funny." And I realized that like this idea of like different minorities don't have the same experiences often. Like I have a privilege of ignoring that a lot, and ignoring the fact that like this is what Black people have to endure like on a daily basis and things. And like that moment really stuck with me because she started treating me differently after she found out that I was not Black and that I was Indian. And like despite the fact that like that was one of the reasons why I realized like, oh yeah, we have to like stand with the Black community because like we are affected by the same biases that affects them on the daily basis. It also made me realize like that shouldn't be our motive for standing with the Black community. It shouldn't take being impacted by it. And I have plenty of friends who are like darker skinned than I am, and they're afraid of being pulled over at night by the police or things like that because they're afraid of being like mistreated because of inherent police biases against Black people and things, and just how they realize that that isn't the only reason to care about it, but it is definitely something that impacts us.
And to add on why we are responsible for educating ourselves, well, at least why it's important for us to educate ourselves is that we are often surrounded by false information. And as an individual, it is important to parse out the truth for ourselves. And when we educate ourselves, we have the opportunity to educate others, which in turn gives them the opportunity to understand and educate others, spreading information as accurate as possible.
Yeah, and I think we're definitely now we're seeing this influx of information, whether that be on social media or on the news or however you consume media. And I guess there's this kind of fear that people are digesting information just through like infographics or in a very like simplified manner that might like homogenize or generalize the situation. So I guess I'm also just wondering, like, what are your thoughts on that, or what have you done to kind of take that additional step and go beyond, you know, just sharing something to your Instagram story or reading it? Not I am in complete support of those kinds of resources. I do think that they make information very accessible, but, you know, at the same time, I definitely think we need to be very particular about what we're consuming. So yeah, does anyone have any thoughts on that?
So I completely agree with you that, like, while it's one step to repost and find new things that you can post about that like spread awareness to other people, I think it's also important to like share research that you do. So like as a group, all of us have been making posts on a weekly basis that like really highlight some of the research that we've been doing each week about different topics related to racism. We started out just like basic definitions, but then we get more and more into like specific things within racism. And I think like doing that research on our own and sharing our own research rather than just reposting really helps create new content out there that people can become aware about.
I think go ahead.
Okay. Additionally, I've seen so many people online or in real life push data points that they don't truly understand that seem to generalize the Black community, whether it be misconstrued data points about crime, which has so many different factors that lead to that, or just different points to just weaponize against the Black community. It does so much violence because they don't really understand the many different factors that leads into that kind of data collection, and also how population size can go into that. So I think it's important to look into those kinds of things.
I think one thing that's really stuck with me is like any audience is an audience itself. Like there's no harm in sharing information and being mindful of like who your audience is, like what kinds of people are interacting with like your messages and stuff, but also understanding what's relevant is really important, I think, and like fact checking everything. Like I have a friend who he really advocates for like fact checking every single claim that you see on the internet, especially if it's like theories and stuff, because a lot of conspiracy theories often harm groups, and there are conspiracy theories like all over the place. And he's a member of the Jewish community, and like anti-Semitism like really impacts him. And even then there's just like so much misinformation. So putting in research and like formulating your own opinions based on the research that you put in, as well as like fact checking and going beyond the first page of Google.
Yeah, so I just want to expand on that. So it's just like it's really important to like challenge all the ideas you find and to like figure out of what in a sense is accurate and what is not, and then to like take that information and try to spread it. So it's like it's really important to have those conversations with either your family members or your friends, and to just like is to have like a peaceful conversation about like what it means and like how it applies to you and all that.
Yeah, and I think some of you already touched upon this, but part of the reason that we are responsible for educating ourselves is because of the privileges that we have, you know, and I think that is a good transition into the next question, which is how has the South Asian community profited from acts of violence against Black people? And I know a lot of times when we think about violence, we conceptualize violence as physical violence and not necessarily microaggressions or like hoarding wealth, even though these are all forms of violence. So please feel free to use whatever definition of violence you feel is appropriate.
Yeah, so I think it's really important to start like on that topic is to talk about the history of the entire thing. So like I think it's important to understand that like anything that like negative that happens to the Black community just like rises other minorities up just a little. So like it started like way back in the day that there used to be a notion that South Asians used to be superior than the Black community, and like how some plantation owners like argue that like Chinese laborers were like docile and submissive and like hardworking and like unlike African Americans. And like this sort of like negative outlook on like this whole situation, like it's like gone through this entire system. And so like any benefits that like Asian Americans like get from the system are because of the anti-Blackness that's already there. And so like that can go through like immigration and all that. And so that's just something to think about.
I think you brought up a really good point about history and like how the racial construction, because obviously race is like not something that's inherently biological, but it's socially constructed. For much of history, the construction of being South Asian has actually been like being Caucasian. And in like Blumenbach's five race theory, he stated that like the Caucasian race was superior because the skulls were more beautiful, and he classified Indians as being South Asian, as being Caucasian. And how in the 1920s, Indians who fought to like gain citizenship or entrance into the U.S. had to argue in court that they should be considered white and essentially better citizens than like other racial counterparts, and how it wasn't really like the individual itself, but just that's where the system lied, that it only benefited people who could take that, who could benefit off of white privilege and such, and people taking advantage of that, often harming like Black people.
And as there is sort of a generalization of each race, having one race that's portrayed as more of a dangerous minority compared to South Asians, which are usually seen as a model minority. As if there's a dangerous minority, then the model minority is relatively seen as relatively better and superior, as both are incredibly generalized.
Going off of what Vennela said, white people will often see all people of color as a monolith of ideas that we share the same thought processes or values. So when we validate racist actions for fear of losing our status as the model minority, we profit off of violence against Black people. Additionally, I want to talk about AAVE. A lot of communities in general have profited off of the use of African American vernacular English, also known as Ebonics. One example is, if you've watched Crazy Rich Asians, the character Aquafina has a very heavy Black accent. Obviously, there's no way to speak Black because Black isn't a monolith, but she puts on a stereotype as, I guess, a ghetto accent. But when she talks about her own experiences in a professional movie, she reverts back to her own speech patterns. So South Asians in general, sometimes will use these kinds of phrases without understanding the roots of that type of language. And while a lot of Black voices have stated that they don't want to gatekeep the use of that type of language, it does lead into more stereotypes.
So expanding on that topic, like I've personally seen a lot of adoption of Black culture and like throughout like my schools and like my community, and like these are through things like vernacular and like slurs and that like stuff. So like this like negatively impacts the Black community, as like one of my friends puts it, as like people don't acknowledge the experience and history that comes along with it. So it's just really it's just important to be mindful about like how it like plays into cultural appropriation versus appreciation.
Yeah, and another thing about AAVE is that it can, a lot of times people view that as unprofessional, even though it's just their way of talking. And a lot of people in their daily life, they use AAVE, but then when they're about to go into something professional, they switch up their the way that they talk. and that's also kind of co-opting like Black culture.
I feel like AAVE has been so prominent within internet culture, and obviously so many of us, like our age type or age group, have grown up with the internet and have taken in these phrases without understanding the sources. That doesn't, I think it's important to just understand where these phrases come from and to not just create this stereotype of how Black people speak.
I'll jump in here. I think that y'all did a really great job of highlighting the micro and macro aspects of how systemic violence shows up in both our just day-to-day culture, but also in our larger cultural systems. And I think one of the things that's important to remember is that none of this is by mistake, that like violence against Black people is a very intentional process that has happened in the US and in a lot of other places in the world for generations. And that part of this process of violence and breaking down of a community is to have systemic power over one particular group in order to have a process work in their way. So if we think about the police, the first police in our country were actually a slave patrol. And so we look at the very systems that exist in our culture today that we've also benefited from as South Asians, as people who live in the Northwest, as like in our community, at least with a lot of folks who are here, the issue of these things being linked to systems that are very, very rooted in our day-to-day lives and systems that we rely on. And so I think the important thing to remember as an umbrella to all of this is that like none of this is by mistake. It's no accident that these things are continuing to happen.
And I think that the intentionality of these like just violent discriminatory practices also calls for a lot of intentionality from our end in combating that. So I guess my next question to you all is how can we, and you know, each of us individually, leverage all the privileges that come with being South Asian, educated, and or wealthy to combat anti-Blackness in the South Asian community, in our larger communities, and just to support Black lives?
Yeah, if I may, that's a really good question. And I think one thing we got to talk about is institutional barriers. So when I say institutional barriers, things such as like systematic oppression, racism, or things that don't allow certain communities to have the same access for other things, such as like education or higher education or workforce. So these type of things are very accessible to us because of the model minority myth that all South Asians, so we're going back to the model minority myth here, that all South Asians are pretty smart and we're all hardworking, so we have a higher access to higher education, such as good universities and good jobs as well. But these kind of things aren't always very accessible for Black people who aren't as financially or educationally accessible as we are. And so I think that also kind of plays into part here.
If I can expand on that, so like the question says that like being South Asian, like educated and wealthy, and like the intersection of all them combined is just, it gives us like a wrongful sense of authority in a sense. So it's like it gives us the power to like spread this knowledge about like the Black Lives Matter movement and like get rid of any harmful or false rumors. So like this comes from like the deprivation of like opportunities in the Black community, and that just, it creates more space for like for growth and like more authority in a sense in the South Asian community. So like so this falls into the model minority myth, and so it just shows how we need to use this opportunity to spread knowledge and talk about the injustices of the Black community.
These are great points. Another point I want to discuss is wealth redistribution. I just want to start up. Obviously, not all South Asians have wealth privilege, and that is a stereotype about our group. But the system in place, the model minority myth, basically makes our worth in this society equal to the amount of labor that we can put out, or how productive we are. And that is not a reason why anyone should have rights. We should have rights because we are people and we deserve them. So wealth redistribution goes against that system that boils us down to just how much we can work. It also goes against a system that devalues the labor of Black people and says that Black people having a high level of productivity is what should give them rights instead of just being people.
I think another thing that Divij brought up earlier, like in one of the earlier questions, was listening to Black voices and uplifting Black voices, and also Indigenous voices and other people of color, but like listening to one another and understanding. And even within the South Asian community, caste privilege is something that like I have because I'm pretty oblivious to like caste discrimination within the U.S., although I have like many friends who do like feel an impact from it. So listening to other members within our own community and from other communities to like understand their experiences and respecting their understandings of the world too is one big thing that I think we can do.
And I also think that developing that empathy is also something that is very crucial to wealth redistribution, as Anya had kind of talked about. So just to clarify, wealth redistribution doesn't have to look like somebody giving away all of their possessions, right? That's not it. It could be like every month making sure that you are like donating some money to like an important cause, or, you know, directly to your friends. I think that's something that has been, I guess, like destigmatized more, is when your friends are in need, when you see GoFundMes, being willing to, obviously if you're able, if you're in a financially stable position, to, you know, just donate some money and not have those like doubts floating in your head of, oh, like, what is this money actually going towards? And like, maybe I should just donate to like a big organization, and just kind of having that trust and being able to, you know, just like empathize with people more. But I do kind of want to go back. We talked a little bit about like model minority versus dangerous minority. And so my next question is kind of related to that. And it is, why is the hardworking immigrant narrative actually very violent and harmful towards Black, and then also Indigenous and brown and low income communities? And also, why does hard work rarely correspond to wealth, especially in Black communities?
So I feel that's a really good question, and that the reason that like a hardworking immigrant narrative doesn't always apply to Black people, and like as you mentioned in the second part, like it doesn't correspond directly to wealth, is because like there's many obstacles in the path for that to be a direct connection that are like put in place by institutionally. As Pranay had mentioned before, there's many things since the beginning of time that like Black people have been in America, such as like Jim Crow laws, and like still things today that prevent Black people from directly having access to things within America. And like I think it's also important for us to recognize as South Asians that our experience as Indians in America is like nowhere as deeply tied to America's history as it is for Black people, and the institutional racism put in place directly affects Black people more than it does our people. So it's important for us to recognize that and know that the hardworking immigrant narrative doesn't apply to everyone.
I agree. And another thing is that this hardworking immigrant narrative gives everyone a false impression that anyone can rise from nothing, despite obvious systematic injustices pushing back on people who are attempting to rise from nothing. And additionally, poverty, which may be caused by systems negatively impacting Black communities, is also more expensive than wealth. Not having money for something leads to problems, which can cause more expensive problems. For example, not having money to pay for a checkup can lead to having to pay for more serious and critical health problems later. And debt keeps stacking up, pushing people further into poverty.
You guys got some really great points. I also believe that the hardworking immigrant narrative is easily weaponized against the Black community, especially when you evaluate the way our family members may have immigrated to the States. It's often merit-based, while the African American community was brought here forcefully through slavery. So this idea that, as both of you mentioned, that anyone can work up from nothing, it's basically it allows the disrespect of Black people who don't have wealth privilege and who are not able to work up due to the systems in place against them, and basically says, well, look at how the South Asian community is doing. They came here with nothing, they brought up, why can't you do the same? But we vary in our histories and our experiences in America.
Yeah, I definitely gotta agree with that. So, like Vennela said, there's a lot of poverty, right? And so that poverty usually has a reason, and that reason could be a lack of, or a bad financial status, right? So, a lot of the times, bad financial status could come from debt, and a lot of that debt is like intergenerational. So, previous generations could have debt, and then that debt keeps working up. Like it keeps building up, which a lot of the time families that had ancestors that were slaves usually deal with that kind of problem. So a lot of them are facing poverty.
I think another thing that Anya sort of brought up was that people often point at people who are like highly successful and they're like, wow, look at all the hard work they did, even if it wasn't hard work that got them to that position. And that especially happens to like discredit the Black community. They'll point at like Beyonce or some other highly successful person and be like, why aren't you guys being like them? When in reality, people could be working like 2 to 3 jobs at a time trying to feed their family, but they're still not able to make ends meet. It's just like valuing the success, but not actively trying to bring up people who are denied opportunities for success, no matter how hard they work. And that even like happens within the South Asian community, where people are like, wow, like look at all those IT workers or doctors, like look how far they've gotten. And then they'll ignore the fact that there are many members of our community who are not given the same opportunities, and there are like many people who work a bunch of jobs, like there are a lot of gas station workers or taxi drivers that they're not able to make ends meet because they're just not able to get the same amount of income, even though they're working really, really hard.
Yeah, so this is where the model minority myth kind of negatively affects the South Asian community, because while it may help us in some cases, like getting higher jobs, it doesn't always help the South Asians who aren't financially stable, because there's a whole spectrum of the socioeconomic situation for South Asians. Some people might be really rich, while some people don't have much money, and that's where the model minority myth kind of negatively affects the South Asian community.
I feel another way that the model minority myth like negatively impacts the South Asian community is like we're only expected to do things related to academics. And coming from someone like me, I play soccer, I love soccer, but when I play soccer at the beginning, a lot of people around me were like, wait, you're Indian. You only do math competitions. You don't, this is soccer. And then at the time I was thinking, wait, is that what I'm supposed to do? Am I only supposed to be good at math? Can I not try being good at sports or something else? And like now as someone who's like matured a little bit more, I realized that like that was how people thought about, that's like what people think about Asians. They're like, oh, they're the people that like always do well in the math competitions, always attend the science fair. And I'm like, I think it's important for us to like create our own identity and then like prove that prove the stereotype wrong as well, because that's not all that South Asians are.
I want to say thank you for Divij for sharing your experiences. Also, some points that I think Oviya and Pranay brought up was that, also Divij did too, that the labor that we do perform within the society is often judged. For example, if we are doctors, technicians, or engineers, we are applauded for our contributions. However, if some Indians are stereotypically truck drivers, taxi drivers, and performing necessary labor, their work is devalued and stereotyped. I also want to say that it's not like communities have not tried to build themselves up. For example, if you don't know, the Black community within Tulsa had a vibrant, luxurious neighborhood, but these efforts as to bring themselves up were torn down by racists back in the old days. So every time that people try to bring themselves up, there is that system that actively tries to tear them down.
Yeah, and to go off your point of having truck drivers and taxi drivers shamed as opposed to doctors and engineers, it's important to not shame a worker, especially if you consume the product. If you are affected by the services a taxi driver or a truck driver does, then you should not shame them.
I think these are a lot of really great points. I think the connection between the myth of the model minority and the way that that actually connects to a larger understanding of how we see ourselves in society and how we've been positioned, again, is all very intentional. That part of the process of the model minority myth was to pit communities against each other, particularly Asian communities against Black and Latinx communities. And the other piece about this is just when we're thinking about poverty and we're thinking of the way that Black people in the U.S. have endured barriers over time, the barriers to Black economic equality is very structural rather than individual. And so instead of working to alleviate them, our current party in power and the systems that exist are rolling back on civil rights protections. They're continuing redlining in communities where it prohibits people from accessing the schools that they want to go to. And so, for example, there's cases where Black mothers will change the zip codes to send their children to better schools and then be put into the prison industrial complex for doing something like that. So I think in considering like the way that poverty is systemic and also the structures that exist within it, we can look at even just a map of where someone would go based on their positioning, based on the fact if they're Black, and what might end up happening to them along the way with the different systems that are put in place.
And I think that is very crucial to kind of making an argument against reform, because I'm sure a lot of you have heard kind of this like debate between like reforming and then abolishing, whether that's police or the prison industrial complex or just a variety of different things. And it Shireen's point just kind of gets to that core idea of the system it's not that the system is broken, it's that the system is actually working perfectly because the system was meant to benefit certain people, you know, and it's meant to commodify people and reduce us to what we can produce because that's just the society that we have been raised in, you know. And the point of all of this isn't necessarily to, we don't just want to expand the model minority myth to, we don't want to associate like productivity and being wealthy and all of like these like capitalist markers of success with more racial groups, right? Like we don't want to put even more people into the umbrella of being like the point isn't to create more wealthy people necessarily, right? It is to kind of like restructure society in a way in which like our worth isn't dependent on that anymore. So it's not just about like deconstructing like the dangerous minority myth or like, yeah, it isn't just about deconstructing the dangerous minority myth. It's also about like taking apart the model minority myth and really reevaluating like what gives us purpose and what allows us to like value other people, you know? But so we've had a really great conversation so far. And I think just for a little bit more like concrete next steps, I'm really interested in hearing about what like daily, weekly, or monthly tasks like all of you can commit to going forward to ensure that you're doing your part in learning about and disseminating information about anti-Blackness in our society. I can go ahead and start. For me, reading has been just kind of at the core of my like unlearning and relearning of a lot of things. And I am very grateful that I do have access to a lot of important literature. I think something that I have also been trying to do is take a lot of these readings, which are often like very esoteric and inaccessible, and either writing up notes to share with friends or like creating a graphic or something like that. And that is definitely something I hope to continue, along with just really just starting with like my family and with my parents, like having those conversations and yeah, just kind of continuing that work.
Yeah, and one thing I was doing that we should all take part in for like, doesn't matter if it's daily, doesn't matter if it's weekly, is to like have more conversations with people. So it's like, as much as like research helps in like spreading knowledge, it's also about talking to new people and like getting that these other perspectives on the opinion. And on that like note is to like break down the impact of tone policing, and it's to like, don't criticize the tone of like other people, but like understand their message that they're trying to convey.
Another thing is to donate money, especially to mutual aid funds, because they tend to work more with the community that they're trying to help and such. And donating recurrently, so like setting a recurrent donation, whether it's like $2 or anything makes a difference essentially, and it's more sustainable in like the long run to do recurrent donations. And that's for people who are like financially able to make that donation. If not, then like another option could be using creativity or skills to raise money. For example, some of my friends and I over summer, we like made stickers that portrayed different aspects of the Black Lives Matter movement or Black liberation and Black history. And we made about $1,300, which was like a really good donation. And we donated the profits to the Equal Justice Fund. So yeah, so doing things like that which involve like making something or providing a service that you can raise money can also work.
I just want to step in real quick. I forgot to say this at the beginning of the question. To all the attendees, if you have any questions that you would like to ask the panelists, please feel free to put them in the chat, and we will have some time to get to those at the end.
Yeah, and what I think is really important to do is to question the current information and knowledge you have and research on your own to acquire accurate knowledge and spread that with others. And to go off Oviya's point of donating, and just in reference to donations in general, all that a nonprofit organization needs to consider itself as a nonprofit is that none of the profits that it makes, I mean, there is no profit that it makes. It either has to be donated or some can go back into the organization itself. So it's very important to know what a nonprofit is, what if you donate to a nonprofit, where the money is going to come, where the money is going to go to.
I think that's really cool. I think personally, I try to center Black voices in what I do, but I realize that Black educators are doing 10 times the work that we've done, and they're doing that to explain their own oppression. So I want to work on compensating Black voices, whether it be like buying from Black authors who've put so much work into creating that sort of information, or donating, as you said, individually to some of the most affected members of our society. For example, Black trans women, or Black non-conforming femmes. I think that's really important because I feel like even within the Black community, there are different people who are affected more. So I want to work on making sure I understand that and working to, again, wealth redistribution. So making sure that the money that I spend goes to people who actually, need it the most.
Yeah, another thing you could do is using social media to spread unbiased information that has been properly researched, right? To avoid the spread of false information, because that's a problem that's going on. A lot of people are spreading false information without actually realizing that that's false information. For example, us as the advocacy group, we've been posting on Instagram. We've been doing our research, making sure we're getting all of our information from valid sources. And so we started out as just defining a few words and then gradually going more in depth. And we've been making sure we were getting all of our stuff from valid sources.
Another really important thing to do is be inclusive in whatever you're doing. As of right now, that doesn't apply that much, but like when you're like outside and you're like in a community or group of people, be sure to include everyone, because like you don't want to make anyone feel left out because it may have racist connotations. And like also it's important to recognize some unconscious biases that you may have and work to stop those biases from making decisions that may seem racist as well. And then finally, as Vennela mentioned before, just reiterating that it's really important that like you stay up to date and you keep on researching on your own so that you know what's up and you know the correct information.
And I think we got a question in chat about like how can we tell and educate our parents about like this being the time to have important conversations about like racism and stuff. I can kind of provide like my own answer for it, and then we can also share more.
Before you jump into that question, sorry, I'm just going to do a really quick plug. Just from the last question, that's something that y'all can do, and I invite you to do it, is to take action. The movement for liberation is long, and it's going to be a long haul. It has been. And so we need folks who are going to be taking action for a number of different ways. And so I encourage you, do your research, get out there, and just know that there are so many ways to participate, and that like we really need folks who have rigor and discipline around wanting to do this work. And so I would say that like if you have even just a little bit of a drive to do one action or to participate in a phone bank, go to a protest, get involved with a local organization, that you do it, because you're not too young or too old. and there's always a place for more people to take action.
And just one last thing, we have gone a little bit over time, so we definitely want to get to the question that was asked, but just be like respectful of everyone's times. Yeah, just to keep it concise.
Okay, to repeat the question, how can we tell and educate our parents that this is the time to have these important conversations regarding the fact that this person's parents and grandparents have been brushing off these conversations because it like doesn't affect us, or saying that they can talk about it later. I've had some similar instances with my parents sometimes, and I know they're listening to this, so sorry for putting you on the spot, but they've also, like, I think one thing that's worked is like considering it family time to like learn together, whether we're watching like a movie or maybe even reading like an article together could be something. So like having family time and discussing it. It's also, especially in like quarantine, I think it's helped our relationships within our family get better. And if that works for your family, whether it's like on road trips or things like that, to just like be like, hey, we should schedule, like even if it's like really like scheduling it into a calendar to figure out a specific time to, you know, discuss it.
So I think another important thing is like, for people who some parents might say that like, it doesn't affect us or it doesn't matter to us. We're not a part of that. I think it's important for us to realize that, as you mentioned in some of our questions, we do benefit from some of the racism that occurs in the United States, and it's important for us to recognize that and then take action to stop that from happening. So even if it doesn't affect you negatively, it's still affecting others because of you. So it's because of all of us. So it's important that we recognize that and we take action on that.
Yeah, I agree. And to go off that, we can think back to how if it benefits us, I mean, if it's detrimental to them, then it benefits us, and it's very important to recognize that. And we shouldn't have these benefits as they are, well, it's not that we shouldn't have the benefits, it's that everyone should have an equal standing. And when there are people who are not at an equal standing, then it's important to recognize and actively work towards creating an equal standing.
Also, I think another thing that that you should like start with is that to start more like general terms, some general definitions. So don't start with this like huge topic that can seem overwhelming or like it's like the people are being attacked or anything. So it's like to start small, like make you up to more like difficult like definitions like colorism and like the model minority myth. And so just like follow that flow in a sense.
I definitely agree. I think, especially when we're confronting our South Asian parents, for so long they've internalized the idea that their work is essential to who they are, and to say, well, you owe this to civil rights leaders, or Black people paved the way to give you that kind of standing in society, or white people have given you that privilege in order to demonize other communities. They see it as an affront to their character. So I would definitely try not to minimize the work they've done. Obviously, so many people have worked super hard to get at that. I think another thing, obviously, as Oviya stated before, we shouldn't just work for this kind of liberation just because of how it may impact us. But one thing that led to a better understanding of what's going on, especially for current events, is seeing a case of a old Indian man who was brutalized by the police, and because he didn't speak English in Atlanta. And that's sort of when it clicked for me. I understand the horrors of everything going on, but to see that happen to your community every single day, I mean, it must take an obvious toll on you. So I think understanding that this could be a reality for so many people, and that it does not just happen in isolation to one community could really help having your parents like see that different perspective.
Yeah, and just one last thing, kind of to wrap up the question and the webinar. There is an Instagram account called South Asians for Black Lives, and they have a link tree that essentially includes like quite a lot of resources that are specific to South Asians and will help kind of starting these conversations with your families. They have resources for South Asians to talk about BLM, a variety of different readings, and then also translations in like Hindi, Urdu, Bengali, and some other languages, just kind of to make it more accessible, especially for those of us who do have a lot of family in India. Yeah, so we are a little bit over time, but I really wanted to thank everyone for being here today, for the attendees, for taking some time out of your day to listen to our thoughts, and obviously to all of the panelists for all the time and the effort and the thought that you have put into all of this. It is really great that we're having these conversations, especially YC, like at that age. I think it's just so important and wonderful that these things are happening and that it's moving. And I've definitely seen a lot of change from when I was like YC age and the conversations that we had, and to now like the conversations that are happening now, that I think is very indicative of the progress that's being made. So yeah, that is a wrap. Thank you all again, and yeah, have a great rest of your Sunday.
I just put the link tree that Tanaya was talking about in like by South Asians for Black Lives in the chat if anyone wants to refer to it. Thank you for attending.
Perfect. Bye all.
Bye, thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you for attending.